Okay, let's get back into Romans. It's been a while since it's like, again, only 2 Sundays, but when you put the days in between them, it seems like it has been for a while. I had to go back and kind of look it up myself and kind of refresh myself. So I'm going to try to do that for you as well, so that we can kind of keep the continuity and the context of the conversation that Paul is trying to have. Now remember, this is one of the last books that Paul writes, and he's writing this from Corinth. He's going to depart from there, and he's going to travel back, and he swings through Ephesus in Acts, and we find that he goes back to Jerusalem. There he gets arrested, and eventually he does end up in Rome. That's part of the opening of the book, as he says, you know, for a long time I've yearned to come to you, and now I am. So Paul had a plan to go. He wanted to go to Rome. The church was established probably by Christians who become Christians. They were Jewish on the day of Pentecost when Paul and them stood up and then declared the gospel. They became Christians. We know that about 5-7 years later that the church was dispersed. And upon people returning back to their different hometowns, lands, Ethiopia, like the Ethiopian eunuch, different people, we see that the church started having their group of Christians meeting. The church in Rome apparently had a reputation. People knew it as a good, strong church and was growing well. They had no apostles had visited them to this point. Then we find that Claudius, the emperor, because of all this disturbance between the Jews and this new cult, they called them, in the church, in Judaism, it was a disruption to the daily function of the city of Rome. It became a threat. So Claudius saw the Jews as one big, group, and Christians not as a difference, anything unique. When he saw him, the Romans looked at him and said, well, them Jews are fighting among themselves. And so he threw them all out. If you're Jew, get out. He wanted them all out. And that was those that were Jewish Christians as well as just regular Jews that were conducting business in town and didn't have anything to do with it. He just threw them all out. So you had that church that started out as Jewish Christians go to Rome, they convert Romans, and now you have Roman Christians, Jewish Christians, and then emperor kicks them all out, all the Jewish Christians. Well, then Nero comes along, that crazy guy, and he lets them come back. And on their return, this is when most scholars believe that there was a disruption, that returning created a rift between the non-Jewish Christians and the Jewish Christians. And so this is probably what he's dealing with. This is a unique letter. I always want you to remember that. This is not a typical epistle letter. This is a letter that stands out in all the letters of antiquity and historical documents written. Any letter that, in other words, that they've ever dug up and found, this letter is even beyond that. This one is longer than any other one. Most of Paul's letters were around 1,200 words. This letter is over 7,300 words. There's no letter written before. So this is an intense topic, is what I'm trying to bring across. Paul saw this as an intense topic of division, and he's already been, if you think about it, he's already been dealing with a lot of problems between this idea of Jewish Christians who are now trying to hold on to the law and trying to then impose that on Christians that were paganistic before, i.e. circumcised, that there were some of what they developed a group within the Christian church that were Judaizers, and what they're trying to do is Judaize, in other words, make Christians Jewish. And one of the ways they're trying to do it is hold on to the old law. They're trying to hold on to that. And by saying that, yes, it's good, Jesus is the Messiah, but you need to hold on to some of that old stuff because it's still really good, like the Sabbath and other things. And one of the big one was circumcision. Paul had to deal with that right away. So he's already been thinking about how this is coming across to Jewish Christians. How does not the scholarly Jew, but the typical Jew that was sincerely coming to Christ, and how do they reconcile some of these problems? And we've already looked at it. We look at it in the book of Hebrews, where the Hebrew writer is dealing with some of that as well. Is that, how can this Messiah, king, also be a priest? According to Mosaic Law, can't happen. How can you take and replace the law and say it's so dead. And you basically are saying that everything that my grandparents and all the generations and ancestors is a waste. No. So there's that type of thinking that Paul has had to come through and kind of systemically develop a way of presenting the logical proof that this is God's systematic process of salvation. And what's beautiful about it is he doesn't ignore all of humanity. He incorporates God's total view of how God has brought forward this magnificent plan in the gospel. And so that's one of the very first things he says, is he starts to address that. But now, as he goes through it, that's what we've been addressing. The first thing he had to address is, one, is the gospel, first and foremost, the most famous line that people know, is that the gospel is what? The power of salvation. That's the opening shot. It's like, I hope I can come and see you. Your reputation is great. I've wanted blah, blah, blah. And then he opens up by saying, I know that the gospel is the power of salvation unto both, what? The Jew and the Gentile. That's the bottom line. Salvation is through that. And then he talks about, really, he equals the playing field by addressing the issue of sin and justification. I mean, the whole issue with mankind is, how do we make ourselves presentable before God? I mean, how can I stand in the presence of God and feel worthy? Because I'm not. Every time I sin, and I will sin, and I will sin again, and I will sin again, and you will sin again, and you will sin again. We will always, in this flesh, be a sinner. So how can you stand before God? And with God being pure goodness, you can't. You just can't. And he's saying that, it's something that God had placed in the heart of man from the beginning, that even the Gentiles who did not have any formal covenant relationship with God, it was evident to them as well, that they knew right from wrong. And because what? How did they get into the current condition to where they would debase their bodies, their minds, and society? He said because of what? They rejected God. And by that, they were admitting, in a sense, that there's a God. There's a moral standard. And everybody knows this. And it's within us. God has placed that in us. Just like we know that we're eternal, like Ecclesiastes, Solomon says there, that God has placed within us the understanding that there's more than just me breathing air in, breathing air out, and then I die. Why is it that when we're at a certain very young age, we look up at space and we go, wow. In the first funerals and death, you start to experience, you start going, wait a minute. What? There's more than this, isn't there? We're the only animal, if you want to look at it in a very humanistic terms, that think that way. Because God did that. God placed within us moral values. Those are not evolved characteristic traits of any animal. And so therefore, because of that, this is what I call the universal law that God has established, a universal rightness from wrong. And whenever all of mankind has turned away, we saw the pinnacle point in the flood. Was there Mosaic Law then? Was there any law that we could find and open up a book in Noah 33 where they had violated this and this? No, but he judged them, didn't he? He judged them. Now, we hear this term, and that's what's so confusing to me at times, and even tripped me up again this week, is where there's no law, there's no sin. You heard that one? So wait a minute, did I automatically go back to Noah's day and go, well then how could you judge them? There was no law. Well, I'm missing something, aren't I? Because that's not what Paul's talking about. You can have either way. You can try to say, but you are with law. There is always a standard. Let's substitute that word for a moral standard. You cannot escape it. And so he starts out with the Gentile pointing that out and saying why God has the right to look at you even though you don't have Mosaic Law, you have no excuse for your rejection of God. You suppressed him in your hearts, and God backed away and let you to your own demise. And you developed into this. So we've taken care of all of humanity, less the Jews. And so then Paul turns to the Jews and says, look, you say you got the law, and you do? Now, when he says that, he's talking Mosaic. You say, let me change that. You say you've got the Mosaic Law, and it's a standard of righteousness? You said it right. You're correct. You teach it, don't you? You teach Mosaic Law says not to murder, not to steal, not to lie. You teach that standard, and you hold that standard over the Gentiles, and you hold that as a gold standard. And then he turns on them, but yet you do them. You're a teacher of God's righteousness, but yet you turn right around, and you're doing the very thing that you're holding everybody accountable for. I think we call that a hypocrite. So now, he then talks and brings them down and says, now, and all he's trying to do in those first chapters is to establish the fact that you cannot, anyone, no one can stand before God and say anything about what they do, what their background is, what their genealogy is, and say, I have a right to stand before God. I can be in his presence. And Paul's establishing, no, you can't. And now, this is where I think Martin Luther went a little bit different, because he had a right idea. I'll concur with him on that. Now, Luther was looking at works in the sense of the rosary, penance, and all these other Catholic processes that you had to go through. And he saw that that's not in the Bible. There's something wrong with that. Those works will not save me. And so he, in expressing the idea that works don't save, it's faith only, he is correct. But that falls short, doesn't it? It's not quite there. But God has the right to bring wrath upon us. And how we view a condition to be able to stand in front of God is very tainted by our own personal objective position, the way we look at stuff. And so all of his judgments and righteousness are good. Now the Jew, thinking for a moment as he's reading this letter, Paul's anticipating those thoughts and saying, yeah, so you're probably thinking, then what good was it for me to be circumcised? What good was it for me to even be a Jew? All I had to do is wait till the Messiah showed up. And he says, no! No! The Mosaic Law is beautiful. And we have this problem too as Christians too, is that we take and we sever ourselves so harshly from the old law that we make it null and void to a degree of, and we make it worthless. Don't we? I know my grandfather used to say that he would study with some people, but one of the things he would do is he would make them put a rubber band on their Old Testament and say, okay, now I'll study with you, because you can only study the New Testament. Now I get it, I understand, because some people would try to go to the Old Testament and get authority. But I thought about that more and more, and I think, you know, that's kind of what we've done. We've done such a good job of saying that our authority is in the New Testament that we've completely just devalued the Old Testament. And the Jews feel that way too. Hey, great, this Christ comes along. He now abolishes all of that. No! He fulfilled it. It's a continuation. There's not two separate. They're one. You cannot divide them. The promise is continuous. And that's how he links the idea of faith in Abraham. And how that you and I, those who have faith in Abraham, like Abraham, we are the descendants of Abraham. Wait a minute, Ron, I checked my genealogy and he's not in there. That's right, because that's not what he's talking about. But the Jews were that way. They were very driven around that idea. Now, judgment and law. Now he's coming back again to Mosaic Law and trying to show that. But now, this concept of righteousness of God through faith becomes murky. And I just say that because maybe it's just my own, I have made it murky for myself. And I think we do that sometimes in defending some of these different teachings and stuff. I think if Paul was alive today, he would shake his head and go, what? What? You guys are so wrong. It's so simple. This is what I was saying. But because of other interpretations that have been layered on top of it, even our own understandings, like I just said about the value of the Old Testament, that we have also kind of lost a part of that. The pinnacle point from changing of everyone unjust and unrighteous is in 3:21. Chapter 3:21, when he says this right here. Because that's what it's all about, isn't it? About righteousness. He says, but now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although, listen to this, the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe, for there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. The last part we know very well. But what about that first part where he's basically saying the law and the prophets, they're a part of it. The law and the prophets talked about it. Remember Psalms 110 in Hebrews? How that David wrote that Messiah was going to be both a king and a priest? And if there was a high priest doing any editing that day, he missed that because he should have corrected poor David and said, now, David, that was a beautiful psalm you wrote, but we know, according to the Mosaic Law, priests have to be from who? Levites. And that's how the Hebrew writer kind of brings up the fact that, and Jesus used it to stump the Pharisees because they couldn't figure it out. And so, so it's the same principle. The law, in other words, it was written. David spoke those things under the law by the Spirit of God. And so this is where Paul as well is supporting that idea that the law and the prophets show that the Messiah is a continuation. It's a fulfillment of everything God has had from the beginning. There's not that continental divide where it flows this way and it flows that way. It always flows one way, and it's always flown from the foundations of this earth to who? To the Messiah. That's what it's all about. And that's why him starting this letter by saying it's in the gospel. That's what it's all about, salvation. So, that's why I wanted to bring that part out, because I think that's so important for us to look at too. So now, he goes to a historical character. He does, the Hebrew writer does it as well. But now from a religious point of view and justification point of view, the Apostle Paul is going to bring this up about how now, and what he's doing is he's kind of like kicking the football out of boundaries. It's kind of like, you kick the football, like, whoa, it's out of bounds. You got to bring it back. We got to kick it over again. He's kicking it outside Mosaic Law. And they're like, whoa. But then they can't argue too hard because Abraham's their man. Abraham's the father. He's a guy. We're all because of him. But he wasn't a Jew. Abraham was a pagan. But he was righteous. Whoa, don't say that about Abraham. I can almost hear a Jew going, whoa, don't call Abraham a pagan. Yeah, he was. Because he was a non-Hebrew. There was no such thing. So that's what I mean about it. It's kind of like Paul kicked the ball and kicked it out of bounds. He kicked it outside the Mosaic Law, but he anchored it in such a point that they have to understand it. They have to go, whoa, wait a minute. What's going on here? Because to a Jew, everything in righteousness is according to Mosaic Law. But it's not. And he started building that up with that pinnacle verse that we read in chapter 3:21. You notice he said there's no distinction. There's only one way. All people are found righteous. And if you had picked up on this idea, he also said at the beginning that would have really thrown him for a loop was when he compared their hypocrisy in the practice of their supposed Mosaic righteousness. He pointed out to them that, they're Gentiles who don't even have Mosaic Law, but yet they're doing it naturally. Now, who do you think God's going to say is more just? The one who says he has the law but doesn't do it, or the one who doesn't have the law but yet is doing it by nature? Which one is God going to say is right? Well, it just blew my mind again. Wait a minute. You can't be righteous outside of Mosaic Law. Paul just said that. He just pointed out that there were some Gentiles that were doing it by nature, the very thing that they were professing and teaching but breaking. And so that's the first salvo he shot to kind of wake them up. And now he's going to bring up a historical character that they really look up to and bring this up. Now, I'm going to be reading from the Great Book because I think that, again, there's a few phrases in here, so it's going to sound really weird when I read from it. But I think it might help as we try to explain some of this. So, again, it's the Great Book, the New Testament in plain English. It is a little oversimplified in some ways, but as far as the translation to the manuscripts, it has been very credible. I've done a lot. I would not be up here if I had questions about it. I really wouldn't. I'm more nervous because I don't want to offend anybody. But I'm tired of trying to not bring it to a level to where you can understand it. And I just love the way this expresses. So maybe if you don't have a translation, I'm going to have it up on here. But just listen to this. You've heard this before, but I think it'll sound different, but a little easier to understand as we go through it. So, chapter 4, I'm so used to using a tablet, I have to use paper now. It's like, so chapter 4, verse 1 through 6. Then what should we say about Abraham, our ancestor? What did he gain from his human experience? If Abraham was made righteous by human effort, then he would have something to boast about, but not with God. What does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and so God declared him a righteous man. Genesis 15:6. Pay does not come to a worker as a favor. He earns it. But suppose a person doesn't work for it. Instead, he believes in God who makes an ungodly man righteous. Then his faith is regarded as righteousness. David talks about this happiness of a man whom God regards as righteous without humanly effort. Sinners who are forgiven are happy. Their sins have been covered. If the Lord does not count a man's sin, then that man is happy. Psalms 32, 1 and 2. Therefore, this happiness is for the Jews and the non-Jews, because we are saying that Abraham's faith was regarded as righteousness. How was it accepted? Did this happen while Abraham was circumcised or when he was uncircumcised? It was during the time when he was not circumcised. When Abraham received the mark of circumcision, it was a seal to prove that he had faith while he had no circumcised. Was considered as a righteousness by God. So, Abraham, an ancestor to all people who are declared righteous, even though they are not circumcised. Abraham is an ancestor of the Jew, the circumcised. Not only of them, he is also an ancestor to people who follow the example of the faith which Abraham, our ancestor, had while he was not circumcised. So, I got a little ahead there. Didn't get my changes. So, when we come back, the point is trying to develop, is when we try to just simplify again the understanding of how is a person found right before God. And the only way is faith. Now, faith is something that's an interesting word because today, in the way that we see it, it's knowledge in which we believe is credible and actionable. So if I listen and somebody gives me some advice, and then I believe what they said, now that's a part of it, that's belief, but faith is also then going to carry through. So for example, somebody tells me how to change a tire. Jim tells me how to change a tire. And I say, I have faith. Jim, I have faith in that information. And I have a flat tire. And I don't do a thing he told me how to do it. I just go ahead and take an axe and beat on it and do all sorts of other things. Now, okay, so did I really demonstrate that I had any faith in the information he gave me? And that's the type of way we look at it. So when we talk about faith, we know that faith comes, Paul's going to talk about that, by hearing what? The Word of God. So this type of application of faith is powerful and needful. But when we look at the way Paul is applying this between the overall righteousness of a man, we know Abraham was a little scoundrelous at times, wasn't he? I mean, yeah, okay. God told him to pick up and go and move to a land, and he picked up and he went. And when he was there, do you remember the time that he went to Egypt and then he lied and told his wife to say that he was a sister? We see times where Abraham was still a sinner. Abraham was still wrong. But it didn't change the idea that the faithfulness is of God that he placed that value in. It was God that's faithful and dependable. And then he would listen to those words and he would act upon them. Now, at times he would waver, wouldn't he? There was times like, for example, whenever he was promised that he would have a child, and he tried to fix that solution by taking one of the concubines or handmaid and have a child, and God's no. He tried to tell God, well, what about Lot? What about the no? So it's not, again, even though Abraham was sinner, he would fail to understand. The faith as well is on the dependability of the person speaking. And that's something where he did demonstrate that when God would give him action stuff and tell him to do it, he did it. He believed that he was going to have a child. He never argued about that. He had questions and he really pushed the envelope, but he still understood that it was going to happen. So God's promise is where we see then him talk about, starting in verse 12. I'm going to go ahead and read 13, starting there. I have 12 and 13 up there. God's promise to Abraham and his descendants, that Abraham would inherit the world, did not come through the law. Instead, it came through the righteousness which comes by faith. If we are truly heirs because of the law, faith means nothing, and God's promise is worthless. Because the law brings punishment from God. Where no law exists, there can be no sin. And that's what we were talking about in the idea that law can only establish a standard. And you either measure up against it or you don't. That's all it can do. And it was a very valuable teaching tool to show people what the righteous moral standard was. And so in showing the fact that their ancestor, he was not a Jew, but yet God called him righteous. And it was because of that faith that he had. So his promise that he gave was something that he believed in. And it didn't come because of the law. That same promise, one of those promises that was given to Abraham, is what we're living today. And that is the seed that would bless all people, which would be the Messiah. So let's go on to 16 through 18. This is why, by faith, so that it would be a favor to confirm the promise that God made to every descendant, not only for the Jew, but also for the non-Jew, who has the same kind of faith that Abraham had. Abraham is an ancestor of us all. This is written, I have made you an ancestor of many nations, Genesis 17:5. In the presence of God, Abraham believed that God could make dead people come back to life, that God could call for things that did not exist, though they existed. Now, there was no hope. Abraham believed with hope that he would become an ancestor of many nations, just as God said, your descendants will be like this. He understood that his body was practically dead, and he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah couldn't have children either. But Abraham's faith wasn't weakened. He did not doubt God's promise. He believed. His faith made him even stronger. He gave glory to God. He was convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. So, because of this faith, God declared Abraham a righteous man. This verse is about Abraham's acceptance. It was written not only for Abraham, it is also written for us. We are going to be accepted too. We believe in the one who raised the Lord Jesus from the dead. Jesus was handed over to die for our sins. He was raised from death to make us right with God. And this is what I have missed for so long, is this idea of resurrection when Abraham looked at himself and realized, in a sense, him and Sarah's bodies were dead, natural. In other words, biologically, they weren't able to reproduce. It would have to be something supernatural. And I always wondered, why did he wait so long? I mean, that was kind of torturous, to wait till he's 100 years old, before he finally blessed him with a child. And what did that do? That really made Abraham stop and realize and really develop the belief that, okay, he has promised us. And that's where his faith as well was growing, because the longer he realized that I'm not physically able to produce a child, my wife is not physically able to produce a child, he's going to take basically the dead biological part of us and bring life. That's, in a sense, a resurrection. Taking the biological side of their ability to produce that's dead and produce something living. That is the power of the example of who? The sacrifice of Isaac. I used to always think, well, it's just kind of a blind faith. No, you see, Abraham already went through this process before he ever saddled up with the wood and the servants to go and sacrifice Isaac on the mountain. You see, when he was 100 years old, and his body basically was biologically dead to be able to produce anything, that God was able to reproduce life out of their dead bodies. And so when God said, saddle up, I want you to sacrifice your son, he knew that he would be able to raise him from the dead. And he knew he would have to. Why? Because remember the conversations he was having? Well, what about this one can be my descendant? What about this one can be my descendant? And God said, no, 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 no. It's through you and Sarah. And that one was Isaac. So now, if he's asking me to kill something that came and basically biologically was resurrected into a child from our dead bodies, and I am now going to sacrifice him, he's got to bring him back. And he can do it. Because basically Isaac is the product, in a sense, of a biological resurrection. I know that may be stretching it. But that's something in showing the power of Abraham's faith. That's pretty strong. And what's so exciting about it is he says that's our faith. Our faith can be just like his. And that's the link that we have today as Christians to Abraham. Yes, okay, 90% of the Christians don't have a Jewish genealogy to connect back. But that's not the point. The point goes back to the same type of belief in what he had promised Abraham, and Abraham believed, Abraham obeyed. We too today, and do we not hold to the idea of a resurrection? And has not God proven that he can raise one from the dead? And has he not also promised to us that we too will be raised from the dead? So how strong is your faith now? That, to me, is amazing and exciting. So we'll continue next week and get more into it, because it does. It gets a little more exciting. So if you're with us this evening and there's something we can do to help you in your relationship with God, whether establishing it by being baptized and becoming a Christian of his, a child of his, or you need the prayers of the church, I hope that you would feel comfortable enough to let us know while we stand and sing.